The Alberta government is bringing down the hammer. After 3 weeks of a teachers' strike, the province is moving to legislate teachers back to work. So where does this dispute go from here? We'll delve into this whole mess up next on the Line Alberta Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to the Line Alberta Podcast. My name is Rob Breakenridge. So great to have you along with us this week. It was 3 weeks ago that Alberta teachers went on strike, a situation that has been dominating headlines and conversations in Alberta. Now, things have changed this week. I don't think the conversation or the debate is ending anytime soon, but the strike will be. The Alberta government is dropping the legislative hammer. They are legislating teachers back to work. Now, they've been telegraphing that this may be coming if the strike was still going on when the legislature resumed. The Alberta government was prepared to play this card. So Monday afternoon, late Monday, in the Alberta legislature, Bill 2, the Back to School Act, was tabled. So it legislates teachers back to work. It uses the notwithstanding clause to deal with some of the collective bargaining rights that come into play. This legislation also imposes a contract on teachers, so there's not going to be binding arbitration or anything along those lines. This is basically the contract that was put to teachers in a vote in late September, something they rejected by about an 89% margin, but that's now the contract that is going to be imposed under this legislation. It was Finance Minister Nate Horner who rose in the Alberta legislature late Monday afternoon to announce first reading of the Alberta government's Bill 2.
I move first reading of Bill 2, the Back to School Act. This legislation would provide teachers with a fair agreement based on the last mutually accepted offer between TIBA and the ATA, and ensure no further irreparable harm is done to Alberta students through labour action. The ongoing strike has deeply disrupted learning and caused lasting harm to our kids' education and futures. After 18 months of bargaining and 2 rejected agreements recommended by ATA leadership, it's clear a negotiated settlement is no longer possible. This legislation ensures that no further harm is done to Alberta students and there is an immediate end to the strike. It also invokes the notwithstanding clause to help ensure stability for the school system moving forward. Mr. Speaker, I move first reading of Bill 2, the Back to School Act.
So the Alberta government intends to get this legislation passed very quickly. There were a series of motions just before the legislation was tabled that will basically limit debate on this bill. So the Alberta government wants to pass it quickly, ram it through, as the opposition have suggested, in order to get teachers back on the job as quickly as possible. So that's likely to happen at some point this week. But of course, we'll see what the fallout is in terms of the reaction from teachers and in terms of the reaction from other unions. The fact that the notwithstanding clause is being used to basically take away collective bargaining rights, that's something that other unions are going to be paying close attention to, and some have already warned about the possibility of some job action or general strikes or something along those lines in response or retaliation to this legislation. We'll see how teachers decide to respond. There are some pretty hefty fines in this legislation for any teachers that defy this back to work order. So why did it all need to go down that way? Now, the Premier wasn't in the legislature when the bill was tabled, but she did hold a press conference earlier in the day that had been embargoed until the legislation was tabled, in which she explained her reasoning, why the government's taking these steps, and in particular, the controversial decision to invoke the notwithstanding clause. Here's what Alberta's Premier had to say about that decision.
Well, I would point out, somebody sent me some history in 1983 when Peter Lougheed was doing back-to-work legislation. He was quoted saying that if a right to strike was determined that would prevent him from doing that, he would convene the legislature and use the notwithstanding clause. So this was exactly the kind of circumstance, I believe, that Peter Lougheed had in mind when he argued so hard on behalf of provinces to include the notwithstanding clause. Notwithstanding clause is part of our Constitution. And part of the reason why it's there is that sometimes there are a lot of different interests that have to be mediated, and those interests have to be mediated by elected politicians. So I would say that this is a very unique case. Certainly not, I don't think anyone should take that this would be a general application. If you look at what the finance minister had to say, the uniqueness of this is that there's two potentials for strike, not only at the general provincial table, but also at the local table. And if there are strikes that are allowed at 61 different school boards, that does not give the certainty that we need. So this is I don't believe any other bargaining table is in that circumstance. I don't think it has that kind of hybrid approach. We thought very hard about what our options would be, and that was the reason, is that this is a very unique case, and I don't think people should indicate any broader type of approach when it comes to labor action.
And as noted, not only does this legislation force teachers back to work, it does impose a contract on them. Now, there were different options for the province, as mentioned. They could have taken this to some kind of binding arbitration or a mediator. Instead, they're imposing a contract on teachers, one that the teachers already rejected, of course. It was the Premier's explanation of that decision.
I mean, we've been watching a number of different actions, and I think the ministers and I have been reading a number of different judgments over the course of the last weekend. You'll note that in the Canada Post dispute, that the federal minister did not order binding arbitration. He actually ordered a mediator to look at the two sides to see if they were close to an agreement. And so, and they just sided with the federal government on that. So I think that gives a pretty clear understanding that there's more than one option to be able to settle a dispute. And I think to the minister's point, in the 11th hour, rather than come closer to us in an agreement, they were further apart than ever, proposing an additional hasty $2 billion additional proposal. That demonstrated to me that if we were going further apart rather than closer together, that demonstrated to me, and I think to the ministers, that a settlement was unlikely. We kept trying. We invited them back to enhanced mediation. They refused, and we kept on trying until today. And so, being that we don't have an agreement to have a second stab with a mediator, this, we think, is going to be able to address the issues in the targeted and dedicated way, requiring all of the input from all of the different stakeholders who are going to be impacted. There's lots of ways to be able to address class size. First thing is transparency. Let's find out where the classes are. Second thing is let's find out how many complex kids are in those classrooms, and then let's engineer a solution at each school board and each school. That's the kind of dedicated work that we're going to start immediately, and we really hope that both the ATA and CUPE will work with us on identifying people who can help us with that.
Now, earlier in the day on Monday, in question period, this was before the legislation was tabled, but some expectation of what was coming, that the province had signaled they were prepared to order teachers back to work, and there had been some rumblings about the notwithstanding clause being a part of that. It was opposition leader, NDP leader Naheed Nenshie's first appearance in question period as a sitting MLA. And not surprisingly, his first line of questioning was about the Alberta government's approach to education funding and how they've been dealing with this whole teachers' strike.
Teachers have been ringing the alarm bell about class size and complexity for years. Yet this government did not include these conversations in any of their negotiations with teachers, and in fact explicitly excluded them from their mediation offer. So the simple question is, does the Premier now believe that class size and complexity are a problem in public education, and when did she come to this realization?
Good question.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to see the opposition leader. I'm sure when we were both 20 years old, we never expected to be standing across from each other when we shared a class that was moderated by Peter Lougheed. Yes, Mr. Speaker, we know that class sizes are a problem. That's why today that we have announced that we are going to be establishing a complexity and class size task force with members of trustees, superintendents, also teachers, education assistants and others who can help us go through and find the classes that are oversized and overly complex so that we can develop targeted solutions in order to be able to address it.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
You know, Mr. Speaker, this government loves its task forces. But we don't need a task force on this. We just need to understand what's happening and listen to teachers. I could go on forever, and I probably will later today, about what we've heard from teachers. The elementary school teacher in Southeast Calgary who has 3 students who require being within arm's length of a grown-up at all times, plus 42 other students in a grade 4 classroom with no EAs. Yet for years, the government wouldn't even talk about class size, and indeed, this government stopped reporting on it. Why hasn't the Premier acted long before now?
We need to report on class sizes in a different way, because the Auditor General found that the $2 billion spent by that government actually didn't result in any meaningful reduction in class sizes. They went up from 18.4 average class size to 20.4. So we're going to go through and we're going to be systematic, Mr. Speaker. We're going to look at the 158 schools that are overpopulated, get down to the individual classroom, look at the individual classroom complexity, and we're going to work with the school boards to assign the teachers and education assistants they need.
Right. Leader of the official opposition.
Well, the new way of reporting on class size is pretty easy. I'll save you the task force. Report on class size.
That's right.
And don't hide the information. Parents across this province are worried. They're worried that their kids aren't getting the best public education, let alone in the world, in Canada. They're worried that with huge class sizes, an ideological curriculum, more complexity, and unsafe schools, our kids are falling further and further behind. So rather than pretend this is a new issue, we need to act. Why has the Premier abandoned Peter Lougheed's dream of Alberta having the best public education system in the world?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just announced this morning that we will be reporting on class sizes. So we have an area of agreement with the Leader of the Opposition on day one. That's very promising, Mr. Speaker. I should also say that when I came in, I looked at where we were at with the amount of money being spent on education, with some of the changes that had been made, and we have made a number of changes that has increased funding 33% since 21-22, Mr. Speaker. That is more than inflation, more than student population growth, and we're going to do a lot more, Mr. Speaker, with this new agreement that we're going to have with the teachers.
So all of that on a very eventful Monday at the Alberta Legislature, as this bill has now been tabled, will be quickly passed, that will order teachers back to work. But again, with the responses from the ATA and other unions, and frankly from Albertans, I guess remains to be seen. But joining us for some further perspective on how teachers are feeling about all of this and where this all goes from here, an opportunity to catch up with an Alberta teacher by the name of Peter MacKay. He also used to be the lead negotiator for the Alberta Teachers Association. So some experience in these kinds of negotiations and how the Teachers Association, the province, approach these issues, but also perspective as a teacher and what they've been dealing with and where a lot of this frustration is coming from. So here's the conversation I had with Alberta teacher, former ATA lead negotiator, Peter MacKay. All right, well, joining us now for more on the teachers' strike and the Alberta government's legislation to bring an end to that strike. Very pleased to welcome to the program Peter MacKay. He's a teacher here in Alberta, was previously lead negotiator with the Alberta Teachers Association, so he's got some perspective on that side of things. Peter, thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Been, I guess, 3 weeks the teachers have been on strike, and I know everybody wants to get back to the classroom. It's just a case of how that all unfolds. But just before we get into it, I mean, just some thoughts from you on what the last few weeks have been like, the uncertainty, being out of the classroom, knowing the impact that this is having on education.
Yeah, like I mean, I'm speaking just for myself, and I guess based on what I've heard from my colleagues, teachers, I think we're honestly shocked that it came to this, that you know, I think that there was, you know, I'm not going to say a strike is never a happy thing or an optimistic thing, but I think there was a sense it's like, well, if we take a stand and we let this government know, like, how dire things are in classrooms, that they'll listen. There was some genuine hope of that, and they just brazened it out, as near as I can tell, and went through 3 entire weeks, and we found ourselves, you know, where we are today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they'd kind of signaled even early on, even before the strike actually began, that they were prepared to play this card. They were prepared to legislate teachers back to work. Was that something that you think teachers were kind of aware of, and did that impact the decision to take this job action at all?
I mean, I genuinely feel that teachers, again, this is just based on the teachers I am sort of in my circle, but I got a pretty wide circle of teachers. I think teachers just felt we had no choice, that what they put on offer for us, there was a mediator's recommended terms of settlement last spring that teachers turned down pretty decisively. And then there was a memorandum of agreement in September that almost 89.5% of teachers turned down.
Right.
And that was on the eve, basically turning that down put us on strike. Teachers really didn't feel like we had any alternative but to take a stand. So from that perspective, they knew certainly at that point that one of the potential outcomes was some kind of legislation, depending on what the government did. But we've also, I think felt that what, parents certainly, and apologies. I got a little pop up on my screen there, that parents have been behind us. We've had, in particular, like I've had a lot of teachers talk to me about how much support they felt from parents, from members of the community, et cetera.
Well, and I think that's probably weighing on the province's decision here, maybe, to just get this over with, deal with whatever fallout, comes in the short term, and maybe people will kind of have moved on in the months ahead. But I don't know, do you see some risk here for the government in not really addressing these issues when the public clearly wants to see these addressed?
Yeah, and there's a couple of elements to this. The decision that they made to impose, they didn't even put us into a process. They put us, like typically there's a thing called binding arbitration, and you can be legislated into binding arbitration. And then the arbitrator takes a look and makes a decision. That's not ideal, but that's certainly preferable to this. This is just outright, they literally, it seems, and again, as far as I know, this hasn't yet, as we're talking, hasn't been passed yet. But assuming that things go the way things go in a parliamentary democracy, they're going to legislate the terms of that agreement that 89.5% of teachers voted against. And they're just like the extent to which they have set fire to any sense of trust between teachers and, honestly, at this point, parents, and this government, and their, any sense that these folks have the best interests of public education in mind. That has faded completely out of sight at that point.
Right.
But the other element is, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you fear then the longer term ramifications of that could potentially be.
The longer term ramifications of that, well, we already saw that to some extent. This has been a while coming, right? One of the things I'm fairly active on social media. One of the things that has gotten a tremendous amount of reaction from people is whenever I post a perspective from someone like a Peter Guthrie or from a former UCP or a conservative or a PC MLA. And I've done that a couple of times. And I mean, I was born in 1970, grew up in the Lougheed era and stuff, been through, been under conservative governments. But this is a different breed of conservative entirely, right? These, all the time, there was a sense, previous conservative governments, that when things go well, that it will lift all boats, so to speak. That, I'm not sure what's going on. My apologies. My camera, I think, is acting up on us here. Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad. That when things go well, that an investment will be made into public education, investment will be made into public health care, that good times for Alberta are good times for all of Alberta. Mm-hmm. And that certainly hasn't been the case. We had an $11.6 billion surplus here in Alberta, and we still had the lowest funded per student in terms of education, the lowest funding per student in the entire country. And they gave no indication that was even the case, really. They fought against that and it was a provable fact based on their own numbers as reported by school boards. So I think trust. I don't think there's any trust at this point, actually, with this government between people, kind of on the side of public education.
Mm-hmm. Can you help us understand, the frustration, even the burnout that teachers are facing? Because we see a lot of numbers on paper about per student funding and about the number of schools and student to teacher ratios and salary grids and all of it. And those are all crucial issues. But I think at the core of it is just what teachers have been dealing with for the past few years. Can you sort of put it into words for us, help us understand the toll that this has been taking?
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, as you mentioned, I was part of the bargaining team, and I'll share with you the analogy I made there. I'm a junior high. I've taught senior high and junior high, and I've taught The Hobbit to teachers. But there's a line not from The Hobbit, from The Lord of the Rings, when Bilbo Baggins says that he feels like too little butter spread over too much bread. That the real problem, I think, that if you're talking to the teachers of Alberta, whereas once upon a time we had enough resources, we had a class of a manageable size, that we had enough supports to deal with the special needs students who were in that class. But now we're at the point where you go home and you feel terrible because you know that students who needed your help didn't get that help because you cannot reach each student to the extent they need to be reached in a class. I hear of people in classes of 43, 45, 47. I have a class, a relatively manageable class, but I had a class in the low 20s, but over half of them were special needs students a couple of years ago, right? So it's not just class size. It is, and you'll hear this from the Minister of Education. You'll hear this from the Premier. They'll acknowledge the importance of class complexity and special needs. But what they don't acknowledge is, this is not an efficiencies thing. There is a point in which you just need more teachers. You need more help. This doesn't, there's, at a certain point, you got to put your money where your mouth is. But they keep talking about it in terms of finding efficiencies, things of that nature.
Right. Well, what's interesting, the Premier said recently, when you look at the number of teachers we have, the number of students we have, just that strict ratio that we shouldn't have an issue. And, there are parts of the province, I guess, where in more rural or remote areas, you probably do have smaller schools or smaller class sizes or even kids from different grades in the same classroom. But then in the urban areas in the big cities, you've got these classrooms that are bursting at the seams, really. So I guess that ratio or those overall numbers maybe don't tell the whole story, do they?
No, they don't, and it's as far as that goes, it's just such a silly kind of way of seeing it, right? Like if you think there's 19 cities in the province of Alberta. If you just take the population of those cities, divide it by 19, then the average is 174,000 people per city. Right. Well, if you did your kind of urban planning, if you had the Minister of Municipal Affairs, addressing, it's all our average city is 174,000. I don't think we need an LRT in any of our cities. It just doesn't recognize realities. And this is also a government that in 2019 stopped collecting class size data. It hadn't been published for a good long time. I think it started getting collected in around 2006, 2008, somewhere in there. Under the NDP government, they started to publish it, but they stopped collecting it entirely. In 2019, and then they're acting surprised when things get out of hand. Like if you're interested in the conditions in classrooms, the very least you can do is aggregate that data and see if you've got disturbing trends. But from that perspective, it's just it's just baffling to me that they would take that step. But they, again, like putting their money where their mouth is. Are they? There is in that story that kind of got released early. It sounds like. There's an indication that they collect and release class size data and class complexity data. I really want to see what that means, because they have to have a meaningful collection of data right? Like they have to actually talk about what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, even in the debate earlier in the day in question period, the premier did say that they're planning to now collect this data, and the opposition leaders sort of mocked how the government loves its task forces. So, I guess they are going to have a task force that's meant to study the issue of class size and complexity. But as you say, I mean, it's a little late to be doing that. We could have been doing that for years. We'd be a lot further along then, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. And it's not, I mean, I had a deputy superintendent say to me, I was like, is it difficult to collect this to aggregate this data? And the response was, it's the press of a button. It's literally just sort of changing the parameters of the reports that come out in there, because teachers, I'm in a kindergarten to grade 8. We do attendance twice a day, morning and afternoon, and high school teachers do attendance every block. That information is collected already. It's put into the system already. It's just a matter of toggling that system so it collects the data, so it's usable, so you can see what the trends are. And you got to keep in mind, I mean, this is a government that stopped collecting data about patients passing away, patients dying while waiting for surgeries, while waiting for diagnostic tests. This is a pattern of behavior these people have shown, is that they kind of turn out the lights when they're going to do something bad for healthcare, bad for education. And that's exactly what they've done. They've been caught doing it, but they don't appear to have any real shame about it, as near as I can tell. They're not owning their errors.
What do you make of Alberta's growth challenges? And Alberta's population has certainly grown, quite rapidly in recent years, and that challenges do come with that. When it comes to the number of schools we have, actual physical buildings, I guess that's maybe not something that can be on the table in negotiations. But I mean, how much of a factor is that? Do we need more schools if we're really going to be able to address a lot of these issues?
I mean, certainly, I don't think anyone and the government has recognized that there was a need. There was a gap there. There was a period of time when this government wasn't building schools, but they've made a commitment at this point to accelerate the building of schools, and that's very, very welcome. But again, this is part of this idea, just like governments do, what they refer to as workforce planning. You have to have that data to keep things, like you have to build sufficiently in advance of anticipated growth. You have to have a sense of what's going on. I'm living up here in Grand Prairie. There's a very new high school, and they're already doing a significant renovation on that high school to try and add, and it's only, I don't even know if it might be 2 years old at this point. Wow. It's extremely new, and they're having to increase it again. Like, plan for the future a little bit, at least the near future. And there was, like nobody's expecting perfection from folks, right? I think it's a story across the entire country that the level of immigration strained a lot of services, right?
Sure.
But to have this government added a multiplier to that by not building schools sufficiently when they should have been building schools. And they were saying Alberta is calling when this was happening. Yeah. And also in addition to that, the multiplier was the lowest per student funding in the entire country. Like, if you do that, in particular, if you do it in a place like the Calgary Board of Education, you're living in Calgary. If I remember correctly, Calgary got 7,000 students. So the way it works is a little in the weeds, but it's a student count on September 30th. That's how your funding is worked out for the year. They got 7,000 students 1 year after September 30th. So unfunded. The next year, they got another 11,000 after September 30th, unfunded. Like, it just puts such strain on a growing school division. You, as a responsible steward of public education, you need to keep your eye on like the blood pressure and the temperature of the patient, so to speak. And they absolutely had no interest in that.
So where does that leave teachers? Because it seems, kind of boxed in at the moment now, being forced back to work, trying to make sure there's no avenue for court challenges. Sounds like there's going to be hefty fines for anyone that defies this back to work order, and then imposing this contract. So there's not even anything to talk about at the negotiating table.
Well, I think by doing what they did, again, I mean, it'd be one thing had they imposed, binding arbitration, which is, I think, the more traditional kind of, at least the more familiar way of doing this. But, and this may be, I could be wrong about this, I think this might be the first time in Canadian history that the notwithstanding clause has been used preemptively in this way to prevent job action, basically to impose a collective agreement, in this case on a group of teachers who turned down the exact collective agreement to the tune of 89.5%. The anger from teachers, it will find an outlet somewhere, right? You're going to have an extraordinarily unhappy group of teachers. I'm not part of the ATA's Provincial Executive Council, but I have to think they will be thinking very hard. There has to be a pushback there, but even more significantly, what about every other union in this province and honestly in this country?
Yeah.
Because if this goes unchallenged, well, then what does collective bargaining mean? And collective bargaining has been, the Supreme Court ruled that collective bargaining is a charter right. They have just taken the charter rights from 50,000 teachers and imposed them without, if they think that people will be quiet about that, well, I mean, I think there's people in the UCP caucus. There was a lot of people who felt their charter rights were violated during the pandemic, and I don't remember those folks being quiet. So I think this is far from over.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's always the possibility, I guess, that we'll go through this task force exercise. The problems will be identified. The government might try to address those. But I mean, do you see any room for optimism here, or is this just the way of the government trying to make all of this go away?
Well, again, I mean, and again, speaking, for myself and the folks I know, I don't have any faith that this government, if they have a task force, they've gone through this process with, in terms of healthcare with restructuring, right? Mm-hmm. And the folks I know in healthcare, I got to say, the morale there is similarly low. The level of trust is similarly low. What they like to do is create some kind of a show of consultation, things like this. But what do they do in the end? They just do what they intended to do in the first place. And I think example one of that is what just occurred with teachers. Teachers, it appears, have been legislated back to work and forced to accept a collective agreement that they voted against almost 90%. That's not consultation in any meaningful sense of the word. Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be rammed through by all accounts. So I guess, sitting here, there's a bit of uncertainty as we're talking, but is it your expectation that you're going to be back in school sometime this week?
Yeah, what I saw, I've got messages. I haven't checked with my own employer. I'm not sure if it varies employer to employer, but I saw several people saying that indications are back on Wednesday. So we shall see, and so will teachers, and again, under these circumstances, what's going to happen, what's going to look like on Wednesday? I honestly don't know. It is as ugly, I've been teaching since 1997. I've never seen it even close to this ugly. I went through, as a relatively young teacher, I went through that strike in 2002, and it's orders of magnitude past that.
Yeah, I think this is the end of one phase of all of this. I certainly don't think it's going to be the last word by any stretch. I guess we'll see what the fallout is this week and beyond as this bill gets implemented and the Alberta government moves to end this strike. Peter, really do appreciate your perspective on all of these issues. And again, thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks very much for your coverage of it. I thought your session with the two folks from the discourse was extremely interesting. I thought that was a great session. Yeah. So, thanks very much.
I appreciate that. Peter, thanks again.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Okay, so our thanks once again there to Alberta teacher Peter MacKay, of course, as mentioned, former lead negotiator for the Alberta Teachers Association, not involved in these negotiations, not speaking in any kind of official capacity for the Alberta Teachers Association. But I mean, the ATA's got to figure out their next move and what's in the best interest of not just their members, but for students, the education system. They don't really have a lot of options. I mean, this legislation does, as we discussed, box them in a sense, where there's not really the avenue to challenge this in court due to the notwithstanding clause. And it's probably not an option to defy this back to work order because there are some pretty hefty fines that this legislation would impose. Now, some other kind of labor action, work to rule campaign is an option too, but I guess teachers got to figure out what's the priority right now. And how's that going to go over if there's further disruption to learning for kids after 3 weeks of a teacher's strike? But at the same time, there's some legitimate issues that have been raised. Opinion polls suggest that Albertans are sympathetic to the concerns teachers have raised around these issues of classroom complexity and overall per-student education funding in this province. So will there be some pressure on the Alberta government to follow through, to say, it's one thing you got this strike over, teachers back to work. What about all of these issues that created this strike in the first place? So this task force has been set up that's going to look at classroom complexity and class sizes. That seems like maybe an arduous process to getting some resolution. There's probably got to be a need to focus on building actual schools in Alberta, and that's something that's kind of outside this whole bargaining process. But a lot of this is going to depend on how teachers react, how other unions react, how Albertans react in terms of what kind of pressure there is on the Alberta government to deliver. So one phase of this story has ended this week with the teachers' strike ending as a result of Bill 2. But a lot of these other issues and a lot of this conversation and debate, I suspect, will continue for quite some time. So we'll see what the fallout continues to be from this. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe, alberta.readtheline.ca. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Line Alberta podcast. We'll talk to you next week. Take care.